Welcome to Lead Pods, the official leadership podcast from USMB for pastors and church leaders, where our goal is to increase our impact together.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 64 of the USMB Lead Pods. I'm your host, Matt Ersman, and we've got a topic today that I'm really excited to share with you. So today I'm going to introduce you to a friend of mine that many of you probably don't know. His name is Robert Carnes. I've known Robert for many years. He's a really great author. He's worked in several different places in kind of a marketing role. Some of you might be familiar with the company Orange that produces a lot of church curriculum. So Robert used to work there, and he's written a couple books. And kind of his area of expertise is storytelling. And whatever your role at the church is, whether you're on staff or a volunteer leader, or even just in your personal day-to-day lives and your relationships, learning how to tell a really good story can really help you improve your communication. So I think we can learn a lot from Robert. I enjoyed a chance to get to talk with him about this today. And we spend most of our time talking about his new book called The Story Cycle. So if you're interested in learning more, you can, of course, check that out wherever you get your books. I highly recommend Robert. So let's take a quick break to hear from a sponsor, and then we'll get to my conversation all about storytelling with author Robert Carnes.
Know of a student interested in vocational church ministry? Students can pursue a church internship through the Leadership Pipeline, which identifies, invests, and empowers leaders for vocational ministry in partnership with USMB. Students will gain real-world ministry experience and help confirm their call into vocational ministry through a paid internship and free leadership training. For more information, visit www.leaderpipeline.net.
All right, my friends. Well, today I'm excited to introduce you to a friend of mine that I've known for several years now. A great guy I'm excited to introduce you to. Today I'm talking to Robert Carnes. Robert is a very experienced marketer, a great writer. I've had a chance to work with him on a few projects. He's always really great to work with. So, Robert, thanks so much for spending time with us on Lead Pods today.
Absolutely, Matt. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yes, absolutely. So you're currently working at a marketing agency called Green Mellon. You've written 2 books. We're going to talk about your most recent one here today called The Story Cycle. You've got a lot of just great experience with marketing. Specifically, a lot of your work has been in church or nonprofit work. What other kind of bio stuff do you want to fill in before we dive in here?
Always fun to kind of be able to tell your life story at the beginning of a podcast. Yes, I never expected to work in ministry, but I got a degree in journalism from the University of Georgia. I'm an Atlanta native. So still living in my hometown, but got out of college and found a job as a director of communications at a church. I've worked in 2 different churches, and I've worked for a couple different nonprofits in the Atlanta area. One of them was faith-based, Orange, which some of your listeners may be familiar with, the company here in Atlanta that produces a lot of church curriculum, leadership material, books, does the Orange Conference every year. So I was with them for several years and really enjoyed that organization. Before now working at a marketing agency, like you said. So it's been fun getting to see the different side, both internal into ministry and nonprofits, but then now on the kind of the for-profit and business side. Our agency actually gets the chance to work with lots of different organizations across industries. So many of them are for-profit businesses, local businesses, but then also we have a few clients that are churches and nonprofits. So I still get to give back, which is fun, but there are a lot of similarities in marketing and storytelling that those many different organizations have, and there are always those little unique different pieces for all the different niches that those businesses and organizations fill. So it's a constant learning journey to figure out how to serve all those different clients well. But it's been a fun journey to this point, and I think has prepared me for whatever comes next.
Nice. Very cool. So we'll talk about the marketing side of things a little bit, but one of the nice things about kind of your expertise here, the concept of storytelling, is it's obviously very useful for business, for marketing, but it's also just a great communication tool for really all areas of our life, right? So
Absolutely.
We'll dive into that here today. But I guess I'm kind of curious. So both of the books that you've written are both around the concept of story and storytelling. I know you've done a lot of research and you just work with stories a lot. So I guess where did that come from? Where did that interest come from? And why is that such an interesting topic to you?
For sure. I mean, I think it's there's a natural human interest in stories, I would think, to varying degrees, but I've always loved reading, both fiction and nonfiction. That's one of my favorite hobbies, even to this day. So there's an element of story within that. But like you said, I mean, my career has been a lot to do with marketing and communications and journalism and writing. And so story is essentially the through line through all of that, through all the different types of jobs that I have had in ministry, in nonprofit, in for-profit agency life. All of it is really helping those organizations to tell stories. So it resonates with me basically both personally and professionally. And so the first book I wrote was kind of from a spiritual side of things of why is the Bible a great story, but also why do we have stories, kind of a love of stories within us. And so the original storyteller, that first book was essentially, well, God gave us that love of stories. God tells stories. Christ told stories throughout Scripture. So I guess it just kept popping up enough in my life that I was like, okay, there's a pattern here that I need to be paying attention to. And there's a lot of people who care about it as well. So I feel like there's a built-in audience who's going to naturally listen anytime you start talking about using storytelling.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think even if most people listening are leaders of some capacity, and if you're ever leading an organization or a group or whatever, and you're speaking, I think a lot of us kind of tell stories just inherently because that's kind of naturally how we communicate.
Right.
But I know I've heard some kind of interesting stats and research and stuff that even if you kind of pause and say, let me tell you a story, people all of a sudden kind of lean in a little bit more. Like if all we do is just rattle off stats or whatever, if you say, wait, let me tell you a story, all of a sudden people's interests are just piqued, because I think we're just drawn to stories, right? Like, why do you think that is? Do you have any idea why are stories so much more interesting than just rattling off facts or however else we might communicate?
Sure. I mean, ironically enough, there are a lot of statistics about how effective stories are. And I don't remember most of those. There are many that are quoted in good storytelling books. I mean, those do communicate a good point. But I think it really boils down to, there's an emotion within a story. Like it connects that information to something deeper within us. There's like an emotional resonance and a personal connection that we find anytime somebody tells a story. I think there's also just our minds work in narratives oftentimes, because it helps us build a logical kind of puzzle. It shows, okay, well, this thing happened, and then this piece happened, and because of that, this person changed in this way. And so anytime we're able to connect those pieces together and form kind of a train of a narrative, it becomes a lot easier for it to stick in our brain just naturally. So that's a lot better than just this random statistic that's not connected to anything else. There's an emotional piece to it, but there's also like a logical piece. And I'm not a neuroscientist, so I don't fully understand the cognitive repercussions of all of that. But yeah, that just logically makes sense that we're more interested in, and like you said, people lean in. So we're a lot more, I guess, attuned to even also remember those stories, because we're paying a lot more attention when somebody starts to weave a story together.
Yeah, no, that's good. Okay, I want to get into some of the kind of specifics on like the marketing and communication side of things. But before we get too deep into that, I'm sure you've come across this too, that whenever we talk about marketing in a church, some people might feel a little weird about that. Like, oh, it's too businessy, or we shouldn't have to market this. It's the gospel. Like, why we don't need to have some kind of slick advertising campaign. It's Jesus. We don't need that stuff. Like, I've heard people say that before. What would you say about that? Like, why do you think, and maybe not even like church-wide marketing, but even, if you're leading a ministry or even like a Sunday school class or a life group or something, how is storytelling relevant to that? And do we need to feel weird about it being too businessy? Like, what do you think when you hear some of those kinds of things?
Oh, that is a whole can of worms, and we could have a whole conversation on this one question alone, I think.
Yes.
But to keep it brief and succinct,
yes.
I think part of it is your approach to marketing. Oftentimes marketing is perceived as slimy and manipulative because some businesses use that approach. They try to trick you, or they try to beat you over the head with a message or something like that. They try to sell you a false bill of goods. So anytime that's the case, sure, we shouldn't use that type of marketing to promote the gospel, to talk about our churches. But marketing in general can be a very positive thing. Seth Godin, who's a great marketing expert, guru, whatever you want to call him, he's written a lot of marketing books. And one of his definitions of marketing is that it's service. Anytime you're marketing to someone, you're trying to provide them with value and show them how you can help them. And that's obviously the mission of the church, is we want to help people. We want to point them back to Jesus. And so marketing is really just a better signpost to point them that way, right? It's a more effective way to communicate this is why the church matters. This is why faith can be important in your life. And so when we take that approach to marketing, it doesn't have to be a negative thing. And frankly, we can learn from some positive business tactics and positive, good examples of businesses who are doing marketing well. We can use those tips within the church and potentially bring more people to faith. So there are certainly different ways to interpret that. And I love that idea and that question behind that. There can be a huge debate behind it, but ultimately it boils down to your intent and your motivations. And as long as those are good and on point, then you should have no qualms or hesitations around promoting the church and marketing for Jesus.
Yeah. Well, in your first book, talked about this a little bit. Jesus was the ultimate storyteller. Jesus was one of the best communicators to ever live, right? And so he kind of mastered that art of, of course, he was God, so that's a little unfair, but like that was a part of his ministry. Right? Was coming up with a clear communication and effective communication methods for the culture that he was in, right? So,
yeah, and to take that briefly, kind of even a step deeper. I'm coming on this podcast in part to talk about my new book about storytelling for organizations. Yep. And that can almost feel a little like manipulative and self-serving. And I've read articles about, should pastors kind of promote themselves and their platform? Should they write books? Yeah. And so again, there's a whole nother conversation there, but I've heard other authors talk about it this way, that if you have medicine that can help, save people, you're almost doing them a disservice by not promoting it.
Right.
So, either whether it's the church and whether it's faith or whether it's a good book and a good, marketing principle, like you almost owe it to yourself, but you also owe it to your audience to promote it and to take the effort to talk about it because it can benefit people. So that's the approach that I'm trying to take with this book and with the things that I have to share, because I'm like, hey, I don't know everything, but I have experience. And I think that church leaders can learn from this, and I put it all in this book, and I think you guys can benefit from it. So there's another level of that too, is that if you really have something genuine that can help people, then it's a good thing to promote it and talk about it and tell stories about it.
Yeah, totally agree. And obviously I know you pretty well, so I know your heart for ministry. You want to do this to help people, which is excellent. So let's talk about that. So the story cycle. So a lot of what you do in the book is you kind of outline, again, story structure, right? People may not be familiar that there are kind of the patterns that most stories tend to follow. And again, when we hear story, a lot of us probably are thinking of like a fairy tale or something. Might be the first thing that comes to mind when you hear story. Again, even when we're just communicating in our day-to-day lives, there is kind of this natural structure or this progression that we typically use. So can you talk about that if people aren't really familiar with that? What is the story cycle, and what's that kind of structure that kind of makes a good story?
Yeah. So I thought about it almost in terms of how we actually create a story. Sometimes even less, because I do talk about in the book what every story needs to contain, how, what's the difference between a story and just an announcement or a piece of information. Like, how do we actually activate a story? Because it's real easy to talk about storytelling, and it's much harder to actually put it into practice and do storytelling.
Right.
But the story cycle itself is almost just the process for how any organization, be it a church, nonprofit, local business, whatever it is, to actually go through the steps of pulling together and telling stories, because most people understand their importance, but can't grasp that, well, how do I do it? And so in a quick way, because it's hard to sum up a full book in a short way, but there are 6 steps that I think any story actually goes through. The first is that you have to listen for a great story, because as a church, we're trying to tell stories not about ourselves, but about those people that we're serving, the people within our community, the people that are benefiting from our services and our ministries. So we have to get in touch with those people and actually hear, how is our church benefiting you? And once you hear that story and capture it, the second step is then to edit it and to craft it in a way that's going to be meaningful to everybody else to hear. Once you've done that, once you've edited the story, then you actually have to share it. That's the storytelling piece of the puzzle, which gets a lot of the attention, but people often forget those first 2 steps that precede it. And once we have shared the story, then there comes a shift. We're almost like passing the torch from our organization to the audience, right? We often forget about that there's there's a curtain there that separates these 2 different kind of players in a story. And you have to remember that your audience is like almost an equal partner in this, the story cycle. So hopefully the fourth step is that they've experienced the story, they've, listened to it, or they've read it, or whatever it is, they've experienced that thing that you have to share. And then the next step is hopefully that they take action on it, right? There should be some clear next step that they have, whether that's, volunteering with your church, or attending worship, or tithing, or coming to an event, or, there's so many different options to engage in a church's story. And one of the small tricks that I've learned in there is don't just leave it vague and open-ended, or don't try to say all of those at once. Connect every story to one clear next action step and say, hey, if you want to have an outcome like this, go get baptized. Like, that's the thing that you need to do. So that's the kind of fifth step, is take an action. And then hopefully, if that action is meaningful and is followed through on, then the person is going to experience transformation, right? And that's one of the ways that a church has the most opportunity to make an impact, because that means one thing for a business if they've got a good product or a good service, but accepting Christ into your life and being baptized and experiencing a good worship service, that has true power for transformation. And so there's a life change that happens there. And the reason it's a cycle is because then that all starts again, right? It goes right back to the beginning, because if somebody's had a life change, hopefully your church is there listening to hear that story, and then be able to do the whole thing over again and share that story that you've experienced and hopefully inspire somebody else. So that's kind of part of the idea behind the story cycle, is that great stories are going to inspire even more great stories and create a self-perpetuating kind of story system within your church and organization that is just going to continue to resonate and impact more people. So that's a lot to unpack there, but that's essentially the outline of what I'm talking about in the book.
Yeah, no, that's great. So let's unpack it, a couple of the steps at least, a little bit more.
Sure.
So you talked about just the importance of listening, right? And I think that's one of these things where, like, it's so obvious that should be our first step, but I think that's probably the one that most people avoid, or they just don't do that very well. So what does that look like for a church to be listening to their community? Can you just talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. Well, I first of all, I think you nailed it in kind of that lead up to that, because we do focus on the storytelling piece, but we very much overlook the story listening piece. And in having these conversations and doing the research for the book, and then, helping to start talking about the book, a lot of people have been drawn to that as well, because they're like, oh my gosh, you're right. Like, I don't think about story listening, but we should be story listening. So I think you're very, very smart to clue in on that one, as so many others have. But I think about it, there's almost two halves to story listening in my mind, and that's passive and active. So passive can be something as simple as putting up a form on your website that I've seen many churches do, that just says, hey, share your story with us. It could be as simple as a form. You could even ask on social media, all these different, digitally is obviously one big way to do it passively, of just wait for people to come to you. I almost think about it like, casting out nets. And waiting kind of for fish to swim in. You got to check those nets and you got to put them in the right strategic place, but it's a nice way to kind of just set up a way to collect those stories and let them filter in. And then the natural, obvious other way to collect stories is active, is going out and actually hunting a fish with a spear, right? You're going to catch, less fish at one time, but you can do it a lot more intentionally and be a lot more focused on that. And what that practically means is pursuing people within your church or within your community or within your volunteer group and asking them, hey, I heard you attended this event. Can you tell me how that went? Or, oh my gosh, you just got back from this mission trip. What did you experience there? What was the most impactful thing? And just start building relationships. And that way that also forms trust, because when there's a great story that, oh my gosh, I'm so glad to hear that you had a great experience there. Can we now share this with the rest of the congregation? Could we create a video off of this that tells this story with other people? And if you've been meeting with that person, if you've had a great conversation with them, if you've built trust first, then you have a lot more likelihood that they'll allow you to tell that story with a wider audience. So that's really, listening is pretty easy to understand, but it's a lot more challenging to actually do. So those are the basic steps for what I think any church or any organization can start to listen. And that also takes time. There's an investment that has to happen there up front. It's not going to happen right away, but that's going to yield a lot more results in the long run.
Yeah, no, that's great. As you're talking, I thought it might be helpful for us to actually kind of talk through like an example. So like, let's say if there's a church listening that they're not really in the habit of doing this, they're not really sure where to start. let's pick, let's say there's a mission trip story that we want to tell. Can you just kind of take us through your 6 steps? So if we know a mission trip happened, but we don't know any details, let's start with listening. How would you kind of walk through those steps if we want to share a story with our church?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, hypothetically, I think, obviously it begins with listening, and kind of like we unpacked there, sit down with either the leader of the mission trip or somebody who attended, somebody who you have a good feeling that, they may have experienced something. Maybe it was their first time out of the country or whatever that might be. It takes time to identify who that subject or that character of the story may be. And you may have to have 3 or 4 of those conversations before you find kind of the right one. But it takes the time to set up those meetings and conversations, and then just be open to listening. So once you've done that, say you have met with the right person right away, and you're able to sit down. Hopefully you've captured it. That's another important piece too, because it's not all going to just stay in your brain right away. So either you're taking notes, or if you've recorded their voice, or maybe even you've recorded them on video speaking about all these things. But you also have to realize that you can't just take that immediately, that recording of the conversation, and just upload that to your church podcast and all right, say, call it a day. You've got to craft it in a way that's meaningful for your audience. So you've got to think about, okay, well, who could be listening to this? Who could be watching this video? What's going to matter to them? What, 2 or 3 minute video or 10 or 15 minute audio clip is going to resonate with them. So you have to sit down and actually kind of then revisit the story and think about it like a narrative, and say, okay, well, we've got to kind of put, the reason why they were interested in going on this mission trip. What was the process of preparing for it? Okay, then they had to actually go out there and they did the mission trip. Oh, then they came back and they experienced, the difference between going to Africa and then coming back home, and that reflection. So you have to think about it logically like a narrative, and then piece it all together. So that's that second step of crafting. Then you're actually ready to share it. And so that may be, again, a video, it may be a podcast, or even better, it could be kind of all of the above. You could have a little, elevator pitch put together where you can share about it from the pulpit, or maybe even invite that person to do it themselves. Again, you could upload the video to social media and your website. Like, I think the point with storytelling, because a lot of people have experienced it and seen it, so it seems pretty logical for most people, but remember that you don't just tell that story one time. A good story, if you've taken the time to listen for it and craft it, hopefully you're sharing it a lot of different multiple places, because that way it's going to reach more people. Or if it's going to reach the same people, it's going to do it multiple times, and they're going to be reminded of why this was important. So you've done all that, you've shared it. Now people are going to start experiencing and seeing it again in one or multiple of the places where you've shared it. So you can almost think about it as a whole pool of audience, in your church or your congregation who've seen this story. Or you can think about that one person who this might impact, right? And you've created an experience for them. They've listened to it and they go, oh my gosh, this is great. What do I do now? Hopefully you've thought about what you want that action step to be. And you say, okay, well, if they've listened to this and it's really meaningful to them, maybe they'll give to Compassion International that impacts other people like this that go on the mission trip. Or maybe they'll go on a mission trip themselves. Like, again, focus on that one action you want them to take, but then they're so moved by what they saw that other person go on the mission trip. They're like, I got to do this myself. Now I may go sign up on a mission trip. And then they experience that same thing for themselves. And then they're the next person who you interview when it comes to talking about that next mission trip. So that's kind of how, again, a hypothetical of how that could play out within that one instance within your church.
Yeah, you explained it really, really well. And I think we kind of briefly got into the crafting part of it, which that part is very, I mean, they're all important, but the crafting is very important too, because I know, like, I do a little bit of like video storytelling at our church, and it is not uncommon at all for us to film over an hour for a video that's going to be 2 minutes.
Sure.
So when you're doing these storytelling, whatever, if it's a video or audio, or if you're going to write something or whatever, you're probably it's wise to get way more than you need, right? So you can really hone in on what you want to tell. But one of the most important things I think you just said is you want to have one message, right? Because let's say you're telling them the mission trip story, but then they go off on a tangent and talk about how, the people where you mentioned Africa, if they're in Africa, but they also needed some other thing. Like if we tell too many stories at once, they lose their impact, right? Can you unpack that and talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Like you said, that was one of the kind of harder ones to really hone in on, because editing is going to be a little bit different for everybody, but it's one of the more time consuming practices in this piece, which is surprising. Some people think, okay, we've shot the video, we're good to go now. Like,
we're done.
That. No,
Yeah.
it can be time consuming, and especially when you really want to do it well, and tell one of those, again, a high end video or a well produced podcast or something like that takes time. But I think you alluded to very well. One of the most important steps to crafting it is kind of removing those details that are going to be confusing or going to be a distraction to the audience. No, we don't want to do that. We want to stay focused on. So let's just edit that detail out, and maybe that could be brought in later. Maybe that is relevant on the video, but it's not relevant when we make it into a blog post or in a social media post or something like that. So keep in mind what platforms you're creating it for. But yeah, I think one of the big things is just whittling it down to all the most important details and really delivering a strong, focused, concentrated story that's driving towards that one key point that you're trying to get your audience to understand.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. So you do storytelling again for churches. You do it for for-profit businesses, you said. Is there anything that you think is specifically unique and beneficial for churches? Like, how can this specifically be helpful to church leaders listening?
Yeah, of course. I think one of the biggest differences between most churches and faith-based organizations versus businesses is churches don't often have the budget or the staff or the resources that many businesses do. I mean, there are plenty of small businesses that are likewise kind of having to pull together stuff on a shoestring, so they get it as well. Right. But for the church's case, though, all of that is kind of compensated for in the fact that we have some of the greatest stories to tell. Most businesses who work in the construction industry, or they're lawyers or attorneys or all that kind of different stuff, I mean, they have okay stories and they can still sell their services fine. But they would kill to have some of the like just great transformative, emotion-filled stories that churches and nonprofits are privy to. I mean, the things like mission trips and giving back to the community and all that kind of stuff, those are the stories that really resonate with people and really attract people. That was one of the things that I loved the most about working in like nonprofits, was being able to the chance to tell those stories and really like tug at people's heartstrings. That's what moves people. So that's a huge benefit that churches can take advantage of, right? And the other side is, okay, the church doesn't have, $10,000 a month to spend on advertising or to spend on, a social media manager or something like that. But you can make up for it because when you tell a story well, the story that, your church has, the story of scripture and of Christ and redemption and all of those pieces, it can really land very much on a lot of people and have a huge impact. So that's one of the biggest distinguishing things between the church and so many different other kind of industries, because everybody's competing for the same attention, right? Everyone's trying to go after the same audience and shortening attention spans and all that kind of stuff. So the church is having to kind of fight in that same battle, so to speak, even though we're in a different industry. But we really have something that can very easily stand above and very easily stand out from the rest of the crowd when it's told in a really good way. And I think that's one of the reasons why churches need to take advantage of stories, because they can, they can tell a story that nobody else can.
Yeah, no, that's great. I totally agree. So one thing we haven't hit on too much yet, I want to hear your thoughts on. So we kind of gave the example of the mission trip, and the way we kind of talked about it ended up kind of sounding like it was either the lead pastor or someone on stage kind of leading through a progression video, whatever. Can you talk a little bit about just kind of our everyday lives? If someone listening maybe isn't on a stage very often, but they're a leader in a different capacity, how can kind of, quote unquote, the average person use storytelling just in their day-to-day, leadership, whatever that looks like for them, if they're not necessarily the first person? Does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, I think it obviously looks different for every different role, because there may be some senior pastors listening who have that ability to allocate time and budget and resources. And there may be that entry-level church communications director who's like, I'm just trying to keep it together. I have so many other things. You're talking about me doing something else. Are you crazy? So it's a different challenge for every different kind of level within the church, or even, frankly, another example is a volunteer who's like, I have 2 hours to give every single week, and I'm just trying to support the church and the staff the best I can. So, I think one of the first ways is just, starting at the beginning of the cycle and listening, being one of those ears. And I think, for the leader who's listening to this podcast, it's good to kind of build that team together intentionally. I mean, hopefully you have people who are already kind of keeping their ears open for these things as they happen, and hopefully they're being able to communicate it back to somebody who has the time to be able to capture a video or write a blog post or whatever. But yeah, to anybody else who's limited on time, who's limited on margin, who doesn't have the leadership or the responsibility within the church, you can still listen for those stories and still find them, and then go back to somebody else or share it with the church staff and say, oh my gosh, I just encountered this, senior in high school who went on a mission trip, and my gosh, you've got to hear their story. And by the way, we should share this with everybody else. So I think when you uncover those things and when you share them and kind of elevate them up the chain, it starts, I mean, because at that point, your audience is the church's leadership. Your audience is the rest of the church staff. And so hopefully it's able to hook them enough. And then you can say, hey, if you were enraptured by that, just think about the rest of our congregation and how much that's going to mean to them. So that can be a great way to hook them in and start to sell them on storytelling. One of the challenges then is, okay, well, how do we find the budget and the time to do this? But once you start kind of finding how impactful it can be, it becomes a process of moving towards, okay, well, we can figure out how to define the resources to share stories like this within our congregation.
Yeah, no, that's really, really good. I like that. And I guess we'll kind of begin to wrap up here. Our time's going fast already, but one thing, if people are, again, whatever role they're in, if they want to do a better job at this, we mentioned earlier that I think we view ourselves as a character in a story, right? If we ever tell stories about our life, we tell them in a story fashion. We are a character in a story. I think there's part of our brain that kind of can do that kind of naturally. We can kind of imagine our life as a movie or a book or whatever. But then also our day-to-day lives are so busy and complicated. Like our actual 24-hour days don't really have that. Well, at least for a lot of people, don't have that one singular focus that we were just talking about. Like a good story has a single call to action, a very single narrative. And so a lot of our lives kind of are a little bit more fluttery, where we're involved in a million different things. You're a dad, you're a husband, you're a storyteller, you're a writer. So I guess if someone wants to kind of really get better at really honing in on one message, if they're going to kind of put this in practice, how can we, in a real world that's actually very busy, very complex, how can we get better at kind of narrowing in our stories to one call to action?
That's a good question. It may vary based on what the story itself is. Sometimes that's pretty clear. In the example we're talking about, somebody went on a mission trip and that mission trip impacted them. So if you want to experience transformation like this, maybe you should go on a mission trip, or maybe you should give money to fund other mission trips like this. I mean, it can be very cut and dry. And then other times it may be a little harder. And sometimes you may need to work backwards and go, okay, what are we trying to promote here? What are we trying to talk about? We're trying to promote the women's event. Okay, well, how do we tell a story that promotes the women's event? Okay, well, let's talk to some people who were there and then figure out, okay, who was impacted by this and who's really benefited from the women's ministry. And then you kind of work towards, okay, well, we know that this is our kind of call to action, is to attend, become a member, or to attend this event, or to hear the speaker, or whatever it is. So sometimes it takes a little bit of kind of reverse engineering. But other times I think it really just takes, like you may find a story and you're like, oh my gosh, this is so incredible. I don't know what the next step is yet, but we need to hold on to this. And sometimes it may take 6 months to a year before that lands in your lap, or before that next event comes up or whatever. So like grabbing the story, holding on to it, saving it in a place where you can tell it later can also be like for the right opportunity to present itself. Yeah, that's smart. Can be tough, but it's like that's maybe what it takes to be able to tell that story at the right time to the right audience. So that's another way to do it as well. Again, it's much easier said than done. It's easy to present examples and hypotheticals that show how that should be done, and it's another one to really try to figure that out within the church. And then one final, I guess, thought on that to kind of try to complete this is making sure that it's not just you looking into it. Making sure that you do have kind of that team around you, that you've maybe crafted an outline for what this story should look like, and then you bring in 3 or 4 different other people who represent kind of a diverse cross section of your church. Maybe you've got a member, and you've got a volunteer, and you've got a person in leadership, and maybe even just a random person from the community. And you say, hey, what do you think about this story? Where do you think this is kind of pointing somebody? What should the clear call to action be? Or are there any elements that are distracting? Like that's, I think, bringing in those other perspectives is an important piece of editing, because
Totally.
oftentimes when you spend hours on something, you begin to lose perspective on it, and you need somebody else to step in and say, well, you realize that this is the clear thing here, or why did you, like, this is a really confusing detail, can you just remove that out? And you're like, oh my gosh, of course, yeah, I didn't think about that, because I've been staring at it for 12 hours and I've I can't see the forest for the trees. So I think between all of those kind of different things, you usually are able to hopefully land on a clear call to action, and hopefully land on a clear narrative that leads to that end.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's so important. I know that's one thing that Craig Rochelle is kind of famous for doing, is whenever he puts a message together, he intentionally gets an 18-year-old, a 56-year-old, a 87-year-old, and a member, a non-member, a volunteer, staff, and he runs it by this really diverse group of people on purpose to catch what you're just saying, because we often get so in the weeds. Things that are really common sense to us aren't necessarily common sense to the people that we'll be communicating with. So
that's right.
I think that's a really smart thing to include in your process.
Yeah, and I think that goes for storytelling, but communicating in general. I mean, anytime we can, again, get an outside perspective on it, get some objectivity to it, it's only going to benefit us.
Absolutely. Okay, Robert, one more thing I want to make sure we get to. Our time's going fast. I didn't get as far as we wanted to. We got a lot of ground to cover, but
that's okay.
I think is really important. So I really love Don Miller. He's kind of the guy who's really brought storytelling kind of in the forefront over the past, I don't know, decade or whatever it's been. And for people who haven't read his stuff, one of his big points that he wants to tell people is that when you're telling a story, it's important that you're not the hero, right?
Yes.
You need to make sure that your audience is the hero. I guess, first of all, do you agree with that? And can you just explain that? Because I think that's also really important for us to understand.
Absolutely. That's kind of one of the foundational understandings of my book. I think it's kind of based on that idea that you're not the hero of the story, your audience is. And I certainly do not lay claim to that. Donald Miller got there first. And I think even there have been other people who've talked about it even well before him. And I think he'd admit that. He's just done a good job of really clearly communicating that and hammering it home. So I definitely agree. I put that idea in my book, and I think that other people should continue to build on it, because it places the other people who are going to benefit in the driver's seat, and it puts you in the role of guide, right? They're the hero who's being led along by your church, by your ministry, by your organization, because you kind of understand it. You're the expert. You have something to offer them, and they're the ones who kind of need to be led along on the hero's journey towards kind of a better understanding and realization. So that's a brief summation, but I think anybody who wants to learn more, Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller is a great book that explains that idea, and is certainly one that I continue to echo as well.
Yeah, because I think that's one of those things that's kind of counterintuitive, because I think as a business or a church or whatever we do, we tend to want to tell our stories because it kind of feels like that's how we'll gain trust, which you can.
Sure.
But if you talk about yourself too much, you alienate, because people want to know, selfish. We're just selfish. We want to know what's in it for us, right? That's part of what just normal communication is thinking about your audience, putting them first, kind of crafting your message around them instead of yourself. So that's a very important part as well.
We have our own perspective. So of course, naturally, we're going to tell the story from our perspective, and it takes all of these arbitrary steps to be able to help shift the perspective from your own to someone else's. That's why, by default, we're just going to naturally tell stories of ourselves. And I think there are those opportunities where we can tell our stories on occasion. I mean, we need to 90% of the time be talking about somebody else. But there are those chances where you can talk about your business and your history and your core values and your founder and all those kind of different things. You talk about your lead pastor, maybe. So there's opportunity for that. But if that's all you ever do, then that kind of gets that shuts the audience out of the story. You're not inviting them into a larger narrative. So they're just standing on the outside going, well, why am I even here?
Right. Yep. Yeah. Super important. Okay, Robert, I didn't get through everything I was hoping to get through. I could talk about this forever. It's a very interesting topic. So I guess as we begin to wrap up, of course, people listening, I encourage you to check out Robert's book, The Story Cycle. I know it's on Amazon, probably wherever you get your books, you can track it down. But what else did we get to, Robert? Anything else you want to make sure we include today? Effective storytelling for churches. What do we not hit that you want to close out with today?
Well, like you said, I mean, we could do an entire part 2 episode of all this.
You could write a book about this.
Oh my gosh, what a good idea. No, I mean, I think we hit a lot of the important stuff. I think listening is one of the things that people often overlook. I think making sure you're talking about your audience as the hero of the story, and that makes you listen to them. I mean, those two go very much hand in hand. So yeah, I think if more churches were able to get just even those two pieces down and practice them a lot more, they would start telling much more effective stories within their church. And that's another, I use the word practice very intentionally, because this is not something, a switch you can turn off and on. It's a skill. It's a muscle that you have to build up over time. And you're not going to do it super well the first time, and it's going to be a little bit better the next time, and even better the time after that. And after you start doing it for a couple of years, it becomes a lot more intuitive and a lot more easy to pull off within just the culture of your church. But even you as an individual, you as a church leader, build up that storytelling skill, just like writing is a skill, or photography is a skill, or preaching is a skill. I think storytelling and the effective practice of that is a practice that you have to just do over and over and over again to get better at.
Yeah. And maybe I'm biased because I work in communications, you do as well. But I think it's not just someone whose job is communication, right? Like, being an effective communicator and being a good storyteller makes you a better spouse, right? Makes you a better parent, makes you a better friend. Like, if you can really get this stuff in your head and kind of practiced, and it comes a little bit more naturally to you, it's going to help you in every aspect of your life, I would say.
This is, so I could talk a long time about this one point right here, but I think one of the good byproducts, both for yourself personally and for your business organizationally, or your church or your ministry or whatever it is empathy. When you start telling stories, you're going to have to start listening to people. You're going to start talking to people a lot more. You're spending a lot more time focused on their perspective. And so you just understand them a lot more. And you're also helping spread empathy to other people, to the audience. You're sharing that story too. And the more diversity of stories that we have to tell, and the more times we do that, we're just going to be naturally a lot more understanding and a lot more empathetic and a lot more caring, which is what the church is supposed to be. So that's obviously a good thing. I think good stories make for better organizations, and great organizations tell great stories. So that's kind of another part of the story cycle as well, is that when you start doing that and making that part of your culture, it's just an upward trajectory from there.
Yeah, it's awesome. Well, you said that really well. I think that's a good place for us to wrap up there, Robert. So thank you very much for being generous with your time today. Thanks for writing this book. I encourage people to go check it out wherever you get your books. It's a great read. So, Robert, thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for all that you do for the church. And thanks for being with us today. Great talking with you.
Likewise, Matt. This is a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Well, Robert, thanks again for your time, spending time with us today, introducing you to the MB family. Really grateful for you being on. And as always, thanks to you for listening. And as we kind of wrap up today, since this is a topic that I'm also really passionate about, just kind of recapping a couple of the big points that I took away from this conversation. Whenever you're telling these kinds of stories, especially in a church setting, it's really important to have one clear action step. Boil things down as simply as you can and invite people to take one step, whatever that might be for you and your church. And again, remember that effective storytelling makes the listener, your audience, the hero of the story. Don't make it too much about you or your church, but craft your stories in a way where the people who are listening are able to see how that can impact them in their lives. So really important topics there, and really grateful for Robert and his work unpacking them and sharing those with us today. So again, I encourage you to check out The Story Cycle wherever you get your books, and thanks again to Robert for joining us today. Okay, our time's running up here, so thanks again for spending time with us today. Hope you have a great week wherever you are, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time here on the Lead Pods.
Thanks for listening to Lead Pods. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing to our show wherever you're listening today. Learn more by visiting usmb.org, and be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll see you next time as we learn more practical tools to increase our impact together.